The idea of teaching with comic books is not a new one. It has been around for decades. However, I think that it can be expanded into different cultural perspectives, importing them into a culture that may be unfamiliar to the student, and by using them locally to help the students see heroes and issues that appear in their own community. Now, before we get into the seriousness of comic books, I would like to stop here for a definition. There are comic strips, comic books, graphic novels, web comics, and I want to say right now that I may say comic book, graphic novel, comic. The unified definition for all these things is that they are a set of static illustrations that are used in serial form to allow a narrative to be told. Now, seriousness. There are several stereotypes attached to comic books. The first one is the art in comic books is crude. It's terrible. It's bad. Well, guess what? I have awful, terrible news for you. Comic books can be stunningly illustrated. The only limitation on comics is the talent, the imagination, the creativity of the creator or creators. The other stereotype says, well, comics always have to be funny. More terrible news. This is not true. At one point, it might have been true, but today you will find more dramatic comics than you will humorous ones. In addition, the other one, which makes me laugh all the time, is only nerdy teenage boys read comic books or have anything to do with animation. You gotta be a nerd and you gotta be uncool. Well, guess what? Turns out that a whole lot of comics are made only for adults, and not only are they made just for adults, they are often made in a way that a variety of people can enjoy them. The last one, it says you gotta have a superhero, it's gotta be somebody in a cape, and that's gonna take away from the learning experience. The kids are gonna be distracted. Well, guess what? That isn't so either. It turns out that when you look at comic books, actually, you will find more dramatic storylines, and no one in a cape may appear. There'll be no one flying. So I hate to disappoint if that is the limited view you might have of comics. Now, why should we use these things in the classroom? The first reason, and the reason I want to emphasize in this presentation, is as an introduction to topics that students may find disinteresting. And you will see a variety of those listed here. However, the second reason we should use comics in the classroom is even more serious. It allows students to go from the metaphorical and the fictional into a real-life situation and make connections that they may otherwise not have thought of because they lacked interest when the subject was first broached. And I know that no teacher or parent in the audience has ever had a problem getting their kid interested in a subject, ever, because the kids are always interested in everything we have to say. So this is impossible, but I'll try to continue anyway. The last reason we should use them is because guess what? A lot of people smarter than me have done research, and they have done it in different cultural contexts. They have found out for literacy, science, social studies, history, you name it, and it's helped. And it's done so all over the world. So what are some comics that we know about from the United States? The bright lights comic books, let's call them, that can be used in the classroom. Well, here's the Batman. Lost his mother and father in terrible violence and made the decision that he was going to rebel. He was going to resort to vigilantism, and he was going to work against the system. But what happens if you're not a billionaire with unlimited resources? What happens if you're not in tight with the police department? and you're thrust into a similar situation, or your whole community is thrust into a similar situation, and you feel like you have to stand up. What are the consequences of that? The Incredible Hulk. Again, you would imagine he can take care of himself. But if you read the comic books or even have paid attention to the films, you will note that the Hulk has done everything to be by himself. He has run away. He has taken up almost refugee status illegally in other countries. He's displaced himself to the point where he's left the planet. And still, even when he tries to cooperate, he finds himself persecuted. What happens if you're persecuted and you don't have immeasurable strength? You're not gifted with the ability to fight back. With the amount of people who are displaced and suffering in the world now from persecution, this is something we should seriously consider. Here are the XMen. As diverse a group of, I was going to say human beings, but let's call them Homo superiors. Mutants. They come from all classes. They are poor, they are rich, they are white, they are black. They come from different countries. You name it, it's in there. But they have one thing in common. They are mutants. And as a result of them being mutants, this causes them to experience things in society that others may not. But almost everyone in any society knows what it feels like at some point to be the other. And we don't have superpowers to compensate for it. So what are some examples of other cultural contexts for comic books? Where else can we find these things? Well, what about Asia? Here is Edward Elric from Full Metal Alchemist. Because of a transmutation accident, he lost an arm and a leg. His brother Alphonse lost his entire body and now lives in a metal shell. So because of guilt and quite a bit of arrogance, because he is exceptionally brilliant, he is trying to make up for the horrible mistake. But what about in real life? When have we misused technology? When has technology been developed that could have been put to better use? Who should control it? And how should we regulate it? This is Captain Levi Ackerman from Attack on Titan. He is what you might call a super soldier. He has been fighting to protect his planet for a long time, and he started very young. However, he has all the usual problems a soldier has. In spite of all his talents, he has his doubts. He loses comrades. He has trouble communicating with other people. He's been horribly wounded. I think these are all themes we can acknowledge will come up in history that students will like or need to tackle. Here are the Boonie Bears. And guess what? They are trying to overcome Lagervik. They want to stop him from destroying the forest. Well, guess what? This is an opportunity, probably for younger children, to deal with, well, when do we need to exploit? How much do we need to exploit? And then look at, what do we need to conserve? What do we need to make sustainable? Africa. This is Karmza. She is a brilliant archaeologist and IT wizard. However, she has multiple sclerosis. And as a result of a dig, she received superpowers in her crutches, which she has begun to use to fight crime all over the place. By the way, this is from West Africa, Ghana. What about how people have been treated with physical challenges and disabilities in the past and in the present? Meet Kwesi. Kwesi means star, by the way, and he's from South Africa, from Gold City, a fictional town modeled after Johannesburg, South Africa. And Kwesi's the usual sort of narcissistic social influencer when he finds out, hey, I got superpowers. He does all the things you think a teenager would do. However, he learns that there are responsibilities to leadership, and he grows and evolves. And how many times in history have we seen leaders grow and evolve for better or worse? This is Razor Man. Razor Man comes from Harare, Zimbabwe. His father mysteriously dies, and he needs to drop out of school. And he is no billionaire. But he comes back to Harare and starts to ask the normal questions. What happened to my dad? The police won't tell him. The government won't tell him. Nobody will seem to tell him everything. So he takes to the streets because he knows Harare very well. Although, what he finds out is the corruption and the crime is deeper than he thinks. And as corruption bleeds the world dry, I think that's something we should take up with the students, and it reoccurs in history constantly. South America. Now, for those of you who don't think graphic novels, comic books can be serious, I would like to tell you first that Mr. Osterheld lost his life for producing these comics between 1957 and 1959. In Argentina, there was a dictator at the time, and he decided to use the metaphor of an alien attack, a deadly snowfall, people having to don suits, and deal with oppression and living in an authoritarian state. When there was a reorganization of the government, he was disappeared, along with most of his family, after they joined a rebel group. After 1983, guess what? This is considered one of the top 10 in the graphic novel genre. Worldwide. It has been made into movies, you name it, because he stood up at the time. So if you think that comics can't be serious, here's news. Here is Mafalda. This is one of my favorites. So Mafalda is a 10-year-old social studies student who just loves social studies. She's a big reader, she's crazy for it, and she gets into it, which we all love when that happens, right? But she's outspoken. So as a little girl, that causes issues as well. So you can look into issues of gender, status, and students getting involved in social activism. Finally, Slavery and Resistance. This is a non-fiction comic from Brazil, and it deals with slaves escaping, forming what they call quilombos in Brazil and other areas where they would literally hold on to an independent civilization and fight back against the Portuguese as they colonized. So this is a fantastic one as well. Now, there are three things I think teachers should remember when deciding to use comic books. The first one is make sure that you do a thorough review of any comic you are planning to use. It is your responsibility to make sure that it is age appropriate and meets the maturity level of your student group. The second thing you should make sure that you do is know the community standards. There will be issues of literacy, religion, race, gender, ethnicity, nationalism. You name it, it can come up. You must be prepared in your locality to do what needs to be done. The final thing is, please remember the curricular requirements of your institution. Remember why you are teaching about the comic books. Don't get carried away because the kids may start getting carried away. You must have a plan to bring them from the non-fictional and the metaphorical back to the standards and benchmarks that the school has laid down in its curriculum. And the last thing I would like to say is remember, importing and exporting these books is much easier because of the internet. You can use them to introduce something that you want introduced to students from another culture, or you can use it in your locality so that the heroes and the characters are more familiar to the students in that area. And with that, enjoy learning, enjoy teaching, enjoy thinking outside the box.
Sound loud.